All right, welcome back to Every Sphere with Eric Reed. I am your host, Eric Reed, and I'm honored that you're here. This is episode 3. I want to keep building on top of this idea that we've established in our first 2 episodes, that every sphere of life matters to God, that there's nothing off limits to Him. It's not just your Bible study time, it's not just your church attendance that matters, but every single domain of life is important to God. He has something to say about it. Even what we're going to talk about today. And what we're going to talk about today is something that I find fascinating. I think you will find fascinating as well. And we're going to talk about a theology of laughter, a theology of comedy. And we're going to look at 2 of the most incredible, successful, funny comedians that are working today. And that is Nate Bargatze and Dusty Slay. Now, these 2 are incredible. They are also both Nashville guys, not necessarily originally. Nate is an OG Nashvilleian. Dusty moved here, but both are local to Nashville, but they are having nationwide, worldwide success. And I think it's really interesting because both of them are Christians. And when you think about the work they're doing, most people would not think about it as quote unquote Christian work. And that's what exposes this dichotomy. We think about Christian work, we think about a missionary, we think about somebody working at a nonprofit or a charity. Maybe we think about a teacher at a Christian school. Maybe we think about a pastor. Either way, what we often think about with a Christian and Christian work kind of falls into these little subtle categories that are primarily church vocational related. And then over here, we have a stand-up comedian. And when we think about Christian work, we don't think about nightclubs. We don't think about Netflix specials. We don't think about dimly lit rooms. We don't think about, late night shows or viral clips going around from bits. Here's the deal. What I'm seeking to do in this show, and I'm really hoping that maybe as you're watching this, some of this is starting to creep in, is that this wall that divides out the sacred and the secular, this wall that in our mind we've created that creates this idea of the spiritual things and then all the physical material things, this Gnosticism that we've kind of imbibed and we've inherently digested into our thinking is not a biblical way of thinking. And so we're going to look at how a theology of laughter is actually biblical. I want you to consider how cool it is to think about this. As human beings made in the image of God, we are distinct from every other creature in that we laugh, we tell jokes, we are able to process information and the language that's being used to see humor and absurdity in things. And it's a really interesting thing, the idea of laughter, the idea of humor, because when you think about the fact that we're made in God's image, then that begins to tell you something really important about the nature of God and how He made us. We are not purely thinking, rational beings. We have rationale because God is a God of rationale, right? We reason because God is a God of reason. We're creators because we're made in the image of a creator. But what does it mean to say that we are made to laugh, to experience joy, to think about comedy and satire and irony in situations? What I want us to think about today is that this idea of having a comedian be Christian and to see their work as Christian work requires a paradigm shift for us. It requires a paradigm shift for us, but it doesn't require us to adopt some new trailblazing theology. In fact, it actually requires us to go back to a theology that we've lost and that we need to recover. And so we're going to talk about this a little bit. Even comedy belongs in that every sphere that we're talking about. And as we think about these 2 comedians in particular, Nate Bargatze and Dusty Slay, I actually want to highlight how both of them as Christians are approaching their work as Christians. And that means that they're approaching it with a certain kind of approach. Now, let's think about this. Genesis 1 reminds us that we are made in God's image. He tells us to be fruitful and multiply. He tells us to fill the earth, and then he tells us to form the earth, subdue it, cultivate it, take dominion. And as you rule over these things, what's going to happen is you're going to innovate, and you're going to create, and you're going to organize, and you're going to have to govern yourselves. And all of these aspects that start developing out of this Genesis 1 cultural mandate, all of these things are the things that we're talking about that begin to become every sphere of life kind of things. And so we've looked in previous episodes like at the work of Gary Vermeer to literally transform the agricultural industry and the manufacturing of equipment to better help human beings innovate ways to subdue and take dominion, to create jobs. So comedy falls into another subset of this idea, but I want to go upstream a little bit and give you some theology, and then we're going to get into some particulars, and then we're going to look at both Nate and Dusty's approach to doing comedy and to understand what it means to do comedy as a Christian and to do it well. So I want to go back upstream. I want you to understand that when God creates the universe, he creates the universe to operate by a set of laws. So God has instilled creational law into the world that he's made, and he's the sovereign over that creation. So these laws are his. And within creational law, there are two categories. There are what you would call the laws of nature, and those are the kind of laws that govern things like physics and, the second law of thermodynamics, and you think about the orbiting of planets around the sun and the way that the galaxy operates. You think about the way that your hereditary DNA operates. All of that is creational law that falls under the category of the laws of nature. And another category under creational law would be what we would call norms, right? Creational norms. And these are a type of law as well, but they're a little bit different than how your circulatory system works, right, in your body. These are the kind of norms that govern society in its different spheres. There are certain laws that God has built into the fabric of even how business should operate, if it's going to operate according to his creational norms. There is good ways of doing it. There are bad ways of doing it. There are wise ways of doing it. There are foolish ways of doing it. These are all under God's creational law, under his creational norms. So this is true about business. So for example, if you want to operate according to God's norms in business, how you treat customers has a set of laws that govern it. If you don't treat customers well, if you don't provide for their needs, if you don't provide value to them, if you continue to raise your prices while you deliver less value, don't be surprised when they stop wanting to pay you for services and your business starts to suffer because you're breaking these creational norms as it pertains to business. The same is true in managing money and wealth. The same is true in politics. The same is true in family and parenting dynamics and relationship norms. God has instilled norms within these different sectors of society. And that is also true in the realm of the arts. When we think about the purpose of the arts, whether that is music or painting, culinary arts, or comedy, art also is governed by sets of norms and laws. There are ways in which they function and operate. We didn't invent these ways, and we're also not simply freestyling every time we ever do anything. There is a design to art. There are forms and structures that make art work. So that's why, not everybody's paintings go into an art museum. If I sat here for you and I drew up something, even though it might have been my true expression, even though it may have been my interpretation of something that I saw or imagined, Even though it may be meaningful to me, it doesn't mean that it conforms to the creational norms that make for good art. In other words, form and design exist within art. That includes dance, that includes acting. Not everybody's a good actor. There are certain things that you have to do to act well. Now, here's my point. The reason I'm bringing all that up is because when we think about the rules that operate within these types of spheres and the things that make things good or not good, we're not outside the spectrum of God's design. In fact, we're operating within God's order in these things. These are God's creational orders and God's ways of systematizing and making the world work according to his standard. So watch, when you think about beauty, that is a deeply human thing. When you think about the experience of beauty, the reason the arts matter, and they're not some secondary thing of importance, they're not just things we've made up to keep ourselves occupied until we get to heaven. The reason that beauty and art matters is because it's God's idea. When God makes the world, he doesn't just make it to be functional. It's not some simple utilitarian functionality. God designs a world that's beautiful. In fact, we inhabit 1% of the universe, not even that much. And what we see in that 1% is absolutely breathtaking. It's beautiful. The earth, the water, the undersea world that exists, the mountains, volcanoes, animal life. When you think about the stars at night, all of these are types of beauties and intricacies and order and design that God has made in our earth and in the world we live in that's beautiful. Have you ever thought about 99% of the universe that God created we haven't even seen? We haven't even experienced. We can't even see it with the naked eye, and yet it exists in grandeur and in beauty. We send telescopes out to the ends of the universe trying to capture images of stars and galaxies and planets, and they're breathtaking when we see them. And you think about this and you go, well, why would God make things like that we won't even experience? Most of human history have never laid eyes on any of it. And here's the answer. Because God values beauty, even if it's not consumed. Beauty is valuable in and of itself. Beauty has worth because it's inherently something that's true about God. God makes beautiful things because God is beautiful. God values beauty. And we're made in the image of that God. And because we're made in the image of that God, not only do we value beauty and experience beauty, we are invited into making beauty. You go to a concert, you go to an orchestra, you hear a song, and it moves you. You're experiencing something transcendent. You're experiencing something beautiful. And it's not just intrinsically beautiful, it's beautiful because it's conforming to the laws that God has built into the world of art. And so if you want to play a beautiful song or write a beautiful song, there are certain forms and structures that have to be followed. If I pick up a violin for you and just start hunking away on the strings, it's not going to be beauty. It will be a noise, but it won't be beauty. Now, what's interesting is we live in a world that tries to erase all of these types of objective standards, and it tries to say beauty is what you interpret and it's what you make it. And here's the reality. The truth is beauty is objective. Now, you can have subjective preferences, like the difference between enjoying country music versus classical music versus hip hop versus rock and roll. Those are preferences, subjective within the art form of music. But music itself and all of the genres conform to these patterns that make it good. Now, God is the maker of those patterns. And our enjoying of that beauty is a part of what it means to be human. God puts us in the world not just to walk around in the world as thinking things. We're not just operating on animal instincts. We are living in a world in which we are interacting with this creation, with each other. And we are participating in things like governing one another. That's politics. And we're engaged in things like commerce and trade. That's where business and economics come in. And we educate one another and we teach one another. And that's where the idea of schools and education and all sorts of things happen. Even what we're doing right now is a form of education. And God wants us to utilize things like the technology to do this and the insights and to transfer this information. This is all a part of God's design in the world. But so are things like beauty, your experience with music, or your watching of a show or a movie. They communicate stories, they communicate truth. All of these things matter to God. Now, I've been talking about this so that I can land the plane on why does comedy, why does humor matter? Why does laughter matter? Because it's a part of God's giving us the art form of comedy, and it's an aspect of beauty. And encountering comedy and humor and laughter is uniquely human. It is a God-given gift. It is a beautiful thing. And there's a reason why people will pay money to buy tickets to go to a place where they're going to show up and a person's going to stand on a stage and tell jokes. And we're going to laugh with that person for 30 minutes or 5 minutes if it's a short bit, or an hour if it's a special. And we're going to enjoy ourselves and we're going to laugh. And then we're going to leave there having had an experience. And here's the thing I want to tell you. Those experiences matter. They're not just, flittering away as we try to waste time. They're not just, exercises in triviality. These are deeply human things, and we're made in the image of a God who gives us these things as gifts. Now, like any art, like any gift, it can be distorted. It can be used to promote falsehood. It can be crude. It can promote errors. It can be evil. And so not every piece of music is good, even if it's conforming to its art form. It can be a perversion of what is good. Not every comic is good. Not every joke is funny. Not every joke that's funny is good. In other words, all these forms can go off the rails, but the form itself is God-given. So it's not a matter of whether or not the substance of the thing is a God-given thing. It really becomes about the direction of the thing. And for the direction to be good doesn't mean it has to have a Bible verse slapped on it. It doesn't have to be explicitly Christian. It doesn't have to explicitly tell the story of the gospel. Sometimes, and not just sometimes, in all ways, the form itself done right and with an eye towards doing it to honor God, conforming within his world, both in our word choices, in the things that we are laughing about. All of these things can conform into the art form in a way that honors God, even if God is never explicitly mentioned. And why does this matter so much? Well, because laughter matters. Laughter brings joy to us, and God wants us to be people of joy. He wants us to see the irony in things. He wants us to see the nuance and absurdity in things. It's okay for us to laugh at our experiences, even our mistakes. These are the types of things that comedians do. In fact, I want to just read this quote. I think this is an incredible quote. John Calvin once said this: "All the arts come from God and are to be respected as divine inventions." That's what I mean by these are creational norms given by God. And these are forms. These forms of art are God-given for our enjoyment, for our satisfaction, and they are deeply human in the sense that they operate here in the physical realm. They are not detached spiritually. They are a part spiritually of what it means to walk in the world as it is. And walking in the world as it is means we live in a world with other people. We laugh, we tell jokes, we tell stories, and all of those are forms that are God-given. Now, what about comedy? What about comedy makes it an art? Well, when you think about humor, humor comes when you see things like irony, or when you see surprise, or when you see absurdities, or even when you see little incongruities in things and you kind of playfully expose those things. And so to do comedy, when you actually are a comedian, what are you doing? You are using your intelligence, you're operating with timing. So, in order for jokes to be good and for stories to land and for punchlines to hit, it's all about timing. It's all about delivering it in such a way that it increases the experience of the listener. There's a cultural awareness. So you're looking at the stories and things that are happening and you're aware of those things. You're using language in order to communicate ideas, but it's not just I'm speaking English. Even my specific word choices as a comedian is going to make or break the bit or the joke. The one wrong word or one word that's not as funny as another word makes the joke not land as well. And comedians are really good at picking language. They work through bits over and over and over again to refine that language. And it requires imagination. It requires imagination. So to be a comedian, you're really using your imagination. You're creating stories and you're imagining scenarios and you're bringing out the humor that's in life. Um, why is it so important that we have this? Um, God is not against laughter. In fact, when you look at the scriptures, you actually see humor everywhere. When you look at the Bible, you see humor. Think about Jesus telling the story about the person who points out the sawdust in his brother's eye, but ignores the log hanging out of his own. Right? So he's like, the person that is pointing out, like, hey, you've got I think I see a speck of sawdust in your eye when you've got literally the entire 2x4 hanging off your face. That's a funny image. And he's playing off the absurdity of such a thing. Pointing out somebody else's speck when you've got the log is hilarious. Or when you think about Elijah with the prophets of Baal, he's actually being so funny. He's kind of goading them. They're being so demonstrative, and they're trying to get their gods, their gods to fall, onto the altar. They're trying to get their gods to respond by sending fire, and nothing's happening. And as this goes on, Elijah just gets funnier and funnier. He's like, hey, maybe he's on a bathroom break. Maybe you need to yell louder. Maybe he's relieving himself. And so there's humor there. Maybe he's taking a nap, call out louder. And the reason it's funny is because it's absurd. A God who can't, send fire to lap up an altar because he's resting or napping or because he needs a bathroom break isn't God at all. That's why it's funny. So you've got these examples all over the Bible, but here's what I love. I love that you got a guy like Nate Bargatze, you got a guy like Dusty Slade. Both of them are incredibly successful comedians. Neither one of them are preachy. Neither one of them get up and are explicitly Christian joke tellers, right? Every bit's not about a Bible character or some story from the Bible. They're not just kind of doing insider church jokes. That's not what it means for them to be comedians who are Christian. In fact, they're really well known because they're just good comedians. In other words, they've really honed in the art and the craft of what it means to tell jokes and to be funny. And as a result of this, watch, they are giving people tons of joy. They are bringing people together in experiences where they're laughing together. They're walking out feeling more committed and united to other people. And they're doing this by just being excellent at what they do. They're not preachy. They're clean. They're not corny. They're genuinely funny guys. And as a result of that, they have built a huge audience simply by doing it with excellence. And it's just interesting to think about how God designed us as relational creatures and how humor is so much of what connects us. And so when you think about what a comedian does, they are bringing us in to these shared human experiences. A comedian is drawing out those awkward social moments that we've all been in before, and they're exploiting the humor in it. Or our family quirks. Nate does this all the time. He talks about the quirks in their family, about the difference between him and his siblings, and how his parents treated the different siblings, and how they were so strict, when he was growing up. And then the last kid comes and there's no rules. And, comedians are great at exposing something that's universal to everybody. Childhood memories or just everyday absurdities. Nate's joked about, his wife is the one scheduling people to come do roof work or to work on the house. And Nate has no idea. And then he feels like he's not enough of a man because he can't do it himself. And his wife is getting people to come do it. And it's just funny because people can relate so much to all of those types of things. And so a good comedian is holding up a mirror and saying things like, hey, isn't this true of all of us? And we all nod our head and we laugh and we poke the person who's watching it with us and we have a good time. As Dusty Slade would say, we're having a good time. And that's what we do. Human beings are meant to live life and have these types of experiences together. And so comedy is not accidental. These guys are not getting up and just shooting from the hip. They're not freestyling. This is crafted. The best comedians are crafting these jokes, and they spend years refining this craft. They spend months refining jokes, and they're thinking about their timing, and they're thinking about their rhythm, and they're getting the storytelling details and the word choices that they use. And they're looking to have moments of surprise where, you're like, oh, you didn't see that coming, right? That's what makes the joke land. And they use wordplay and double meaning. And this is all craft. This is art. And the thing that I'm really trying to drive home is that God loves this. This is the kind of world that God made. And he made us to be the kind of creatures who could do that kind of craft and art. And we can do it for the joy and the laughter of other human beings because it's conforming, again, to his norms. And directionally, we're doing it in a way that does not dishonor God. That's why you can be a comedian who has all the forms right, but then you can do it in a direction that's not God honoring and it's not pleasing to God. And you're exploiting people and you're making fun of people, or you're berating the audience, or you're just crude, or whatever it might be. So like any other art, whether it's music or it's painting or it's acting or maybe it's literature and writing or architecture, there is form, and that creativity reflects the creator. And the creator made this world full of beauty and color and variety and imagination. And comedy is adding to that an element that we would say is playfulness. The idea that our God is playful, that he's enjoyable, and he makes the world enjoyable. And we live in the world not for it to just be functional, but delightful. And so that's why sunsets matter, and it's why music matters, and it's why humor matters, it's why good meals matter. All of this is a part of living in God's world. So historically, some Christians have been, fearful of comedy and, going to listen to stand-up. There may even be Christians who have been hesitant to get involved in stand-up because you think to yourself, well, stand-up is all about telling inappropriate jokes or being crude or crass or mocking people or degrading people, being vulgar. And the scriptures do warn us not to do any of those things. But here's the choice that a comedian has. And it's a false choice, but Christians who want to get into comedy often put themselves under these two guardrails that I think are false dichotomies. They either think to themselves, well, I'm going to be explicitly Christian, which then often turns into low quality comedy. So I'm going to be explicitly Christian, but I'm not going to be really great on the craft and art form. And that becomes just kind of a subpar thing. And it's not as good as it could be. The other thing is you can say, well, I don't want to be explicitly Christian because I might turn people away. So you kind of hide your faith, or even worse, you kind of set your faith into a different category and you embrace all the bad parts about going into comedy, the mocking, the vulgarity, the exploitation, right? That kind of thing. And you don't want to do that either. So the Christian worldview says, no, I want to do this and do it well. I want to do it with excellence. I'm going to be great at the form. And I don't want to have to do it in such a way that it feels preachy all the time. And it feels like I always have to land it with a Jesus juke. You can actually be a great comedian who's a Christian by being a funny guy and by bringing out all the things that are funny about life and humans and relationships and life in our culture and society. And you can do it in a way that's clean, it's thoughtful, and it's relatable. So here's how I came across these guys. And I just think it's a fun story to think about. It was in the summer of 2019. I was preaching at a summer camp, and there was a group of guys who said, hey, after the worship session tonight, we ought to go back and watch a Netflix stand-up special. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm in. Who are y'all thinking? And they're like, Nate Bargatze. And I'm like, who's that? And they're like, dude, you haven't heard of Nate Bargatze? You don't know who he is? I was like, no. He's like, he's from Tennessee. He's from your area. Aren't you from Lebanon? I'm like, I am. He's like, he's from around there. Turns out he is. He's from Old Hickory. You know, he grew up and been in Mount Juliet, right? He's literally in my neighborhood. Talks about the Wilson County Fair. That's literally in my town. And so I'm like, yeah, sure, let's watch it. So we turn on the Tennessee Kid, his 1 hour stand-up special. And I am laughing. I mean, my jaws are sore. And it's this aha moment where I'm like, he didn't cuss. He wasn't inappropriate. In fact, I could share this as a pastor on social media and say, you need to go watch this guy, and have no reservations, no disclaimers, no, hey, language warning. Don't have to do any of that. In fact, I could have my kids watch it with me and they would find it funny too. And so all of a sudden I become this Nate evangelist. And during COVID, a few months later, I'm having people come and, watch Netflix with me. And I become like, every time somebody new comes, I'm like, hey, have you ever watched Nate Bargatze? They're like, no. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And Tennessee Kid goes up. And then from there, I went back and watched his 30-minute stand-up where he's a part of the Netflix, show called Stand-Ups, or the Stand-Ups. And every 30-minute episode is a different comedian. And Nate had a 30-minute bit, and it's hilarious. And so turns out this guy's been doing comedy for years. He's been in New York and Chicago. He's traveled all over the country doing stand-up, even when he was not, some big famous guy. And over the last several years, Nate has just taken off into another stratosphere. And it's not changed how he approaches comedy. In fact, if anything, it's cemented that his approach can be highly effective and successful. And so to be successful, he didn't have to change who he was. To reach beyond just a Christian audience, he didn't have to get crude or crass. He's just really good at his craft. And Nate has talked about his faith. Nate has been interviewed by the New York Times and other publications and podcasts. And Nate on one show said this. He said, I am second. He lives his life with an I am second mentality. He says, second to God, second to my family, second to the audience. You kind of live to serve, he says. It's very much a calling in that aspect. And I love that. This is Nate's approach. I'm second. I'm second to God. In other words, I am not Lord, he's Lord. I'm second to my family. I am the leader of my family, but I'm here to serve them. I exist to take care of them. I provide, I protect. I'm second to the audience. In other words, the audience isn't there to serve me. The audience isn't there to make me feel special. The audience isn't there for me to beat up or to exploit or to get something from. He approaches stand-up and being on a stage, whether in front of 20 people or 20,000 people, to serve them, to bring laughter, to bring levity, to bring a sense of unity around the things of life, and to give people a good time to experience with their families or individually that they can talk about and share with others. And I just think it's so special. And he says he very much sees his life and his work as a calling in that aspect. In other words, watch, he's not a preacher, he's a comedian. And yet what he's doing is every bit as important to God as the work of the preacher. And it's not because he's gotten big. Even if he did this, on a circuit, going to the small clubs for the rest of his life, and it provided for his family and he provided joy to people, it doesn't matter if he's an international star doing movies. It's because he's doing it right. And he's doing it in a way that honors and glorifies God. He's doing it as a Christian. And Dusty Slay is the same way. Dusty Slay wears the trucker hat and has the big glasses and the long hair. And, my wife actually told me about him. She went to a comedy club in Nashville called Zany's and saw him. She was there to see somebody else. He did a bit and she was like, oh my gosh, Eric, you've got to look up this guy. So we get on YouTube and we start watching Dusty Slay clips like crazy. And then we find out he's at Zany's, again, and we go watch him live. And then we saw him open for Nate a couple of times at a few different shows. And all of a sudden, we're Dusty Slay fans, and it's the same kind of thing. He's not explicitly Christian in his content, but he's a Christian, and he's funny, and he's doing stand-up as a comedian with excellence. And he's studied the craft and he's learned the art form and he works on it. And he's somebody that's his natural self, his genuine self. And because he's a Christian, it shapes where he goes and where he doesn't go in his comedy. And I just want to commend these guys as individuals who are working in a secular space, but are actually living like people who don't believe in such a thing. They're Christians who are living in God's world with people made in God's image, and they are accessing the art forms and the things that God created in creational norms like comedy and what makes things funny. They are understanding how to operate with timing, and they're seeing the absurdity in things, and they're playing on hypocrisies, and they've learned satire. They know the art form, and they're doing it as Christians, not with a little cross on it, but with excellence. And I commend them. I think as human beings made in the image of God, understanding that God delights in comedy, especially comedy that goes in the direction that honors him. Even if it's just talking about the funny frictions and foibles of married life, or, trying to get on to a kid that's not acting right. There's humor in that. And it's a universal human experience. And bringing that to life and drawing that stuff out in comedy and with bits and with punchlines and jokes. These are things that God cares about because it reflects something about the world that God has made. It's a world filled with joy. It's a world filled with creativity. And when you practice comedy with truth and with skill and with excellence and without degrading people and without celebrating sin, it actually becomes another way that human beings can reflect the image of their creator. And that's what I would say Nate and Dusty both do. They are reflecting the image of their creator in how they approach their craft. And it is why I believe that they are drawing audiences and people to their comedy that otherwise maybe would not if they were over the top explicit in being Christian comedians. And so if you're an artist, let me just give you a few things to take away. One, think about your gifts as not less than spiritual. Okay. If you are using your gifts to paint or to create or write music or play music, or maybe to write stories or to write jokes, your gifts are not less spiritual. Okay. They are tools to glorify God and to serve others. As Nate said, it's a calling to serve in that aspect. The second thing I would say is create with excellence and imagination. Don't let being Christian lead you to create something subpar and you call a Christian this. As Christians, we ought to create with excellence and imagination in everything we create. We want to create beauty. And that requires being really skilled at the forms, the design, the order that comes with that, and also elements of surprise that are needed to make it beautiful. And the third and last thing I'll say is use your art to convey truth, even if that truth is truth that's universal to all. Truth is a gateway to God because all truth belongs to Him. And when you are telling the truth and you're pointing people to the truth, even by highlighting absurdity and joking at things not true, you are de facto pointing people to that current, that river that leads to the Lord, that truth that leads back to God. And you can use that to touch hearts. And as you do that, you are honoring the Lord and you're glorifying Him in what you do. So, guys, every sphere of life matters. Nothing's off limits. It's not just your Bible studies, it's the comedy clubs as well. And enjoying God doesn't just happen in your quiet time and devotional times in the morning. It happens as you sit beside your spouse and you laugh until your cheeks hurt at a stand-up comedian who's telling jokes that resonate with your own life and your own story and your own experience in the world. And that's why we need comedians, and it's why we need a good, healthy theology of laughter. Every sphere belongs to Him. Until next time, remember, Christ is Lord of it all, so live like it.